They hurt you, and now they're gone. No explanation, no accountability, just distance. And you keep asking yourself, if I mattered, why would they disappear? But what if I told you their silence is not strength, it's fear exposed? And what they want deep down is something they don't yet have the courage to face. They didn't walk away because you were too much. They walked away because what you offered required presence, honesty, and emotional courage, and they were not prepared to meet themselves there. An avoidant does not flee love. They flee what love awakens inside them. When they hurt you and then hide, it feels personal. It feels like rejection. It feels like abandonment. But listen carefully, avoidance is not power. Avoidance is protection. And protection is always born from fear. They hide because closeness exposed something they've spent a lifetime burying. Your sincerity disrupted their emotional survival system. Your depth challenged the walls they built to feel safe. And instead of rising to the moment, they retreated to the only place they know: distance. Deep down, what they want is not separation. They want relief from the discomfort of feeling seen. They want peace, vulnerability, connection without exposure, love without surrender. But that kind of love does not exist. You see, an avoidant's greatest conflict is this. They long for intimacy, yet they fear losing control more than they fear losing people. So when emotions intensify, when accountability calls, when truth demands presence, they disappear. Not because they don't care, but because caring feels dangerous to them. And here is where divine wisdom enters the story. Life will always reveal the difference between those who heal and those who hide. One grows through discomfort. The other runs from it. One leans into truth. The other escapes it. And no amount of love can transform someone who is unwilling to face themselves. What they want deep down is to feel safe enough to return, but not to the conversation, not to the apology, not to the growth. They want to return to control. They want to believe that distance erased the impact, that silence protected them from responsibility, that time will soften what accountability would have required them to confront. But healing doesn't work that way. When you choose dignity over chasing, when you stop explaining your worth, when you release the need to be understood by someone committed to misunderstanding themselves, you step into alignment with something higher. And here is the quiet truth most people miss. Your healing unsettles those who hide. Because when you rise, they are left alone with the very emotions they tried to escape. Avoidants don't fear losing you as much as they fear the mirror you hold. You reflect what they could become if they chose courage. And that reflection can feel unbearable to someone who has built an identity around emotional distance. So don't mistake their silence for clarity. Don't interpret their absence as certainty. And don't confuse hiding with peace. What they want deep down is resolution without responsibility. But what you are being guided toward is something far greater than freedom with integrity. Let them hide if they must. You were not called to chase shadows. You were called to grow in truth, to love with wisdom, and to walk forward without shrinking your soul. Because the ones who are meant to meet you again will not need to run from the light you carry. Avoidant behavior is rooted in fear, not indifference, and this truth changes everything when you finally understand it. But looks like coldness is often emotional overwhelm. What feels like rejection is usually self-protection. The avoidant does not wake up intending to withhold love, they wake up bracing themselves against the possibility of pain. Their nervous system learned long ago that closeness equals danger, that dependence equals loss, and that vulnerability leads to disappointment. So when emotions deepen, their instinct is not to lean in, but to retreat. Fear shapes their responses in subtle ways. It teaches them to intellectualize feelings instead of experiencing them. It convinces them that needing someone is a weakness rather than a human truth. It whispers that staying detached keeps them safe, even when that detachment slowly starves their heart. This is why avoidant behavior can feel so confusing. The desire for connection exists, but it is immediately followed by alarm. Love activates longing, and longing activates fear. Indifference would be simple. Indifference would not wrestle internally. Indifference would not disappear only to think about you in silence. Indifference would not require so many emotional strategies to maintain distance. Avoidance, however, is effortful. It requires constant monitoring of emotions, constant suppression, constant withdrawal. That effort is fueled by fear of being seen, fear of being needed, fear of being exposed as someone who does not know how to stay emotionally present. Often, this fear was learned early. It formed in environments where emotions were dismissed, punished, or ignored, where connection felt inconsistent, where safety depended on self-reliance. Over time, the avoidant learned that closeness could not be trusted, so they learned to trust distance instead. That lesson became a pattern, and the pattern became an identity, not because it was true, but because it felt survivable. When you entered their life with sincerity, openness, and emotional availability, you unknowingly challenged that identity. Your presence didn't just offer love, it threatened their emotional blueprint. And fear does not negotiate, it reacts. It pulls away, it minimizes, it rationalizes. It convinces them that leaving is logical, necessary, even noble. But beneath those explanations is a simple truth. Staying would have required courage they have not yet developed. This is why avoidance can hurt deeply and then vanish. Not because I don't feel remorse, but because facing the impact of their actions would require emotional intimacy with themselves first. Silence becomes a shield. Distance becomes a refuge. Hiding becomes a way to regulate fear without having to transform it. Understanding this does not excuse the harm, but it reframes it. You were not ignored because you were unworthy. You were withdrawn from because you mattered enough to activate something unresolved. The fear was not about you, it was about what connection demanded of them. And here is the quiet, sobering reality. Fear can only be healed by facing it. Until that happens, avoidance will keep repeating no matter who enters their life. Different faces, same pattern. Different story, same ending. Because fear does not dissolve through escape, it deepens. Seeing avoidance as fear allows you to stop internalizing their behavior. It allows you to release the illusion that loving harder would have changed the outcome. It restores clarity where confusion once lived. And clarity is the beginning of peace. Silence is often a defense, not a decision of strength, and understanding this distinction brings a deeper clarity to what you experienced. When fun goes quiet after causing harm, it can look like confidence, control, or even indifference. But true strength does not need silence to survive. Strength communicates, takes responsibility, and remains present even when emotions are uncomfortable. Silence, in many cases, is not a power move, it is a shelter. For an avoidant, silence is a way to regulate internal chaos. When emotions rise, their system interprets it as danger. Words feel risky because words invite accountability. Conversation invites vulnerability. And vulnerability threatens the emotional walls they rely on to feel safe. So instead of facing the discomfort, they retreat into quiet, believing distance will calm the storm inside them. Silence becomes their emotional armor. This is why their absence feels so loud. You are left with unanswered questions, unfinished conversations, and emotional weight you did not create alone. Meanwhile, they convince themselves that not speaking is the mature choice, the peaceful choice, or the respectful choice. But silence that avoids truth is not peace, it is avoidance disguised as composure. If silence were strength, it would not be selective. It would not appear only when conflict arises. It would not surface only after harm has been done. Strength shows up consistently. Silence shows up when fear has nowhere else to go. It is easier to disappear than to admit confusion. Easier to withdraw than to say, I don't know how to handle this. Expem and seen as flawed. Silence also offers control. When they stop responding, they regain the upper hand emotionally. They decide when, if ever, the conversation resumes. They no longer have to witness your pain or sit with their impact. This sense of control can feel stabilizing to someone who fears emotional exposure. But control achieved through silence is fragile. It postpones reckoning, it does not resolve it. What makes this especially painful is that silence can masquerade as finality. You may interpret it as closure, rejection, or confirmation that you never mattered. But silence rarely carries the meaning we assign to it. Often, it carries what the other person cannot say. Confusion, guilt, shame, fear, or emotional overwhelm. They go quiet not because they are unaffected, but because they are unable to process what has been stirred. There is also an unspoken hope embedded in silence. A hope that time will soften the edges, that distance will erase intensity, that if enough time passes, the need to address the hurt will disappear. Silence becomes a way to delay emotional responsibility without having to consciously refuse it. But strength does not delay truth. Strength understands that discomfort is temporary, while avoidance compounds pain. Silence may protect them from facing the moment, but it leaves you carrying the weight of both sides. And that imbalance is not strength, that is emotional self-preservation at someone else's expense. Recognizing silence as defense allows you to stop chasing explanations from someone who cannot give them. It shifts your focus from their absence to your own grounding. You begin to see that the quiet was never about your worth, it was about their capacity. And capacity, unlike love, cannot be forced into existence. Avoidants crave safety more than connection, but secretly want both, and this inner contradiction governs much of their behavior. On the surface, they appear self-sufficient, emotionally contained, and unbothered by distance. Yet beneath that exterior lives a deep, often unacknowledged longing to be chosen, valued, and emotionally held. The problem is not the absence of desire for connection, it is the fear of what connection requires. Safety to an avoidant means predictability, control, and emotional self-reliance. Connection, however, introduces uncertainty, mutual dependence, and emotional exposure, elements their system has learned to associate with risk. Safety becomes their primary currency. They choose emotional environments where they feel in charge, where expectations are low, and where they can retreat at the first sign of vulnerability. This does not mean they do not value closeness, it means they prioritize feeling emotionally intact over feeling emotionally connected. When forced to choose between the two, safety always wins, at least consciously. But unconsciously, the desire for connection continues to pulse beneath the surface, unresolved and unmet. This is why avoidants often send mixed signals. They approach, then retreat. They open up, then shut down. They express interest, then disappear. Each movement toward connection triggers an internal alarm. The closer they get, the louder the fear becomes. Their nervous system equates intimacy with potential loss of autonomy, loss of emotional stability, loss of control. So they pull back, not because the connection is unwanted, but because it feels unsafe. What they truly want is a version of intimacy that does not cost them their defenses. They want closeness without dependency, love without obligation, and understanding without exposure. They long to be accepted without having to fully show themselves. This is the silent wish driving much of their relational behavior. But real connection does not operate on these terms. It requires mutual presence, emotional risk, and the willingness to be affected by another person. The tragedy is that the more they prioritize safety over connection, the more isolated they become. Distance may reduce anxiety in the short term, but it amplifies loneliness in the long term. They may convince themselves they are better off alone, that relationships are too demanding, or that emotional independence is superior. Yet moments of quiet reveal the truth. The longing does not disappear, it waits. When someone enters their life offering emotional availability, patience, and sincerity, it awakens this buried desire. They feel drawn, seen, and energized by the possibility of closeness. But as the bond deepens, fear resurfaces. Safety feels threatened. Old patterns activate. And instead of negotiating their fear, they retreat to the familiar ground of emotional distance. This retreat can feel abrupt and confusing to the other person, but internally it feels necessary for survival. What avoidants secretly want is not to be chased, fixed, or rescued. They want to feel safe enough to stay, safe enough to risk being known, safe enough to believe that connection will not cost them their sense of self. Until that safety is cultivated internally, no external relationship can sustain intimacy for long. Understanding this dual longing allows you to stop interpreting their withdrawal as a lack of feeling. It is not that they did not want connection, it is that they did not know how to hold it without losing their sense of safety. And until that inner conflict is resolved, they will continue oscillating between wanting closeness and choosing distance, between the heart's desire and the nervous system's fear. Hiding is their way of regaining emotional control, especially after a moment where that control felt threatened. For someone with avoidant patterns, control is not about dominance over others, it is about self-regulation and survival. When emotions become intense through conflict, closeness, or the realization that someone else has been affected by their actions, their internal balance is disrupted. Hiding becomes a strategy to restore that balance as quickly as possible. Control for an avoidant means minimizing emotional exposure. It means reducing variables that could lead to vulnerability. When a situation calls for emotional accountability, reflection, or repair, it introduces unpredictability. They cannot anticipate how they will feel, what they will have to admit, or how deeply they might be affected. This uncertainty triggers anxiety. Instead of sitting with it, they retreat. By hiding, they regain a sense of predictability. No conversations, no emotional demands, no immediate pressure to respond. This withdrawal can look calculated from the outside, but internally it is often impulsive. Their nervous system moves into self-protection mode. Silence, distance, and disappearance are not tactics to hurt you, they are methods to calm themselves. Hiding narrows their emotional field. It reduces stimulation. It gives them space to breathe, even if that space is built on avoidance rather than resolution. Hiding also allows them to rewrite the narrative in their own mind. Without dialogue, they do not have to face alternative perspectives. They can justify their behavior, minimize the impact, or frame the situation in a way that feels less threatening. Emotional control is reinforced when they are the sole interpreter of events. This inner narrative provides comfort, even if it is incomplete or distorted. Another reason hiding feels empowering is that it halts emotional momentum. Conversations have energy. Emotional exchanges create movement toward clarity or change. For an avoidant, that movement can feel overwhelming. By disappearing, they freeze the moment. Nothing progresses. Nothing deepens. The emotional intensity that was building suddenly collapses. In that stillness, they feel in control again. However, this sense of control is temporary. Hiding does not resolve the underlying emotions, it suspends them. The fear, guilt, or confusion remains, waiting for another trigger. Over time, this pattern strengthens the belief that avoidance works. Each time they hide and feel relief, the behavior is reinforced. Control becomes associated with withdrawal rather than engagement. From your perspective, their hiding can feel like punishment or manipulation. It can feel as though they are choosing power over connection. But their definition of power is different. Power to them is not emotional mastery, it is emotional containment. They are not trying to win, they are trying not to feel exposed. The cost of this strategy is connection. Each time they hide, they create more emotional distance, not only from you but from themselves. Control achieved through hiding comes at the expense of growth. It prevents the development of emotional resilience, communication skills, and trust. It keeps them safe, but it also keeps them stuck. Understanding hiding as a bid for emotional control allows you to disengage from self-blame. You begin to see that their disappearance was not a reflection of your value or behavior, but a reflection of their internal coping limits. And while hiding may give them temporary relief, it cannot give them the deep, stable safety they are ultimately seeking. Your healing disrupts their illusion of emotional distance in ways they rarely anticipate. When an avoidant pulls away, there is often an unspoken belief that separation will freeze time, that distance will keep emotions contained and unchanged. They assume that while they are retreating to regain control, you will remain emotionally tethered, waiting, questioning, or carrying unresolved feelings. This belief allows them to maintain the illusion that emotional distance protects everyone involved. But when you begin to heal, that illusion quietly collapses. Healing shifts the emotional balance. As you process, release, and grow, the dynamic no longer revolves around their withdrawal. Your energy becomes grounded rather than reactive. You stop seeking explanations from someone who cannot provide them. This internal shift is subtle but powerful. Even without direct contact, it alters the emotional field they believed they had left behind. What once felt paused begins to move forward without them. For the avoidant, this can be deeply unsettling. Distance was supposed to neutralize emotion, not awaken consequence. When they sense that you are no longer waiting in the emotional space they abandoned, it confronts them with a reality they were trying to avoid. Their actions had impact, and life continued. Your healing becomes a mirror, reflecting what they chose not to face. It challenges the comfort of emotional disengagement. What unsettles them is not your independence, but what it symbolizes. Your healing represents emotional integration, something they struggle with. It demonstrates that pain can be processed rather than escaped, that growth can occur through engagement rather than withdrawal. This contrast exposes the limits of their coping strategy. Where they sought relief through distance, you found strength through presence. Avoidants often rely on the idea that emotional distance erases accountability. If there is no conversation, no visible reaction, no immediate feedback, they can convince themselves that the situation dissolved. But healing does not erase memory, it transforms it. As you heal, the narrative changes. You no longer carry the wound in the same way, and that transformation disrupts their sense of emotional control. There is also a deeper layer at work. On some level, avoidants expect that if they return, they will resume the same emotional position. They assume access will remain unchanged. Healing removes that guarantee. Your growth introduces boundaries, clarity, and self-respect. The version of you they left behind no longer exists. This realization can create discomfort, even regret, because it means the cost of avoidance was real. Your healing does not punish them, but it does end the illusion that distance is consequence-free. It highlights that emotional disengagement does not stop time, it only delays responsibility. When you move forward, you no longer participate in the emotional stalemate that avoidance depends on. The power dynamic shifts quietly, without confrontation. This is why avoidants may resurface when they sense your detachment. It is not always about reconciliation, often it is about reassurance. They want to know whether the emotional distance still exists on your side. Your healing disrupts that uncertainty. It signals that you are no longer defined by their absence. Understanding this allows you to continue healing without guilt. Your growth is not an act of abandonment, it is an act of alignment. It is not meant to provoke them, but it inevitably exposes what they tried to escape. And in that exposure, the illusion of emotional distance loses its hold. Avoidants feel deeply but struggle to face what they've been through. Beset, they didn't learn or ability, and this internal conflict defines much of their relational experience. Contrary to the assumption that they are emotionally detached or indifferent, avoidants often experience emotions with significant intensity. The difference is not in the depth of feeling, but in their capacity to remain present with those feelings. Vulnerability to them feels like exposure without protection. It activates fear rather than connection. They are often highly aware of their internal world, but that awareness is filtered through caution. Feelings are monitored, contained, and evaluated for risk. Joy is tempered. Attachment is questioned. Longing is quickly followed by self-restraint. This constant internal regulation creates the impression of emotional distance, when in reality there is emotional activity beneath the surface that rarely finds expression. Vulnerability threatens the systems they rely on to feel safe. To be vulnerable is to admit need, uncertainty, or emotional dependent states that contradict the identity many avoidants have built around independence and control. They may have learned early that expressing emotion led to disappointment, dismissal, or loss. Over time, they internalize the belief that feeling deeply is dangerous unless carefully managed. This is why moments of emotional closeness can feel both exhilarating and terrifying for them. Connection awakens desire, hope, and warmth, but it also awakens fear. Fear of being seen too clearly, fear of being needed, fear of being unable to maintain emotional equilibrium. Rather than navigating these feelings openly, avoidants often suppress them or create distance to regain composure. Their struggle with vulnerability also affects communication. They may want to express care, remorse, or longing, yet feel paralyzed when the moment arrives. Words feel risky. Once spoken, they cannot be taken back. Vulnerability requires staying present even when emotions fluctuate. For an avoidant, this feels like standing without armor. Silence or withdrawal becomes the safer option. Internally, this creates tension. The desire to connect does not disappear, it becomes contained. Emotions are experienced privately, sometimes intensely, but rarely shared. This containment can lead to emotional fatigue. Over time, feelings that are not expressed begin to weigh heavily. The avoidant may feel overwhelmed without fully understanding why, attributing the discomfort to the relationship itself rather than the suppression of vulnerability. This is where misunderstanding often arises. The other person may sense depth but encounter distance. They may feel closeness followed by sudden withdrawal. This inconsistency is not manipulation, it is ambivalence. The avoidant is torn between the heart's desire for connection and the mind's insistence on self-protection. Facing vulnerability requires trust in one's ability to cope with emotional outcomes. Avoidants often lack this trust not because they are weak, but because their coping strategies were formed around avoidance rather than integration. They learned how to retreat, not how to stay. Understanding that avoidants feel deeply allows you to stop equating their withdrawal with a lack of care. It reframes their behavior as a capacity issue rather than a value judgment. This understanding does not minimize the pain caused by avoidance, but it brings clarity. The distance was not created because the feelings were shallow, it was created because the feelings were too threatening to face without fear. Divine timing separates those who heal from those who hide, not as punishment but as alignment. There comes a moment in every relational journey where growth demands a choice: to turn inward with honesty or to turn away in self-protection. Divine timing does not rush this moment, nor does it announce itself loudly. It simply presents the opportunity again and again until a decision is made. Those who heal accept the invitation. Those who hide decline it, often unconsciously. Healing requires patience with discomfort. It asks a person to sit with emotions they would rather avoid, to question patterns they once defended, and to take responsibility for the impact of their actions. This process unfolds gradually, guided by timing that cannot be forced. When someone chooses healing, they align themselves with growth, even when it is uncomfortable. They trust that clarity will come through engagement, not escape. Hiding, on the other hand, is an attempt to control timing. It is the belief that stepping away will pause the lesson, that distance will delay the reckoning. But divine timing does not operate on avoidance. What is postponed is not erased, it is simply deferred. Those who hide may feel relief temporarily, but the unresolved waits patiently, resurfacing in different forms, relationships, or circumstances. This is where separation occurs, not necessarily physically, but energetically. When one person begins to heal, their awareness expands. They see patterns more clearly. They recognize where they compromised themselves and where they grew stronger. Their values shift, their tolerance changes. Meanwhile, the one who hides remains oriented toward preservation rather than transformation. Over time, these paths diverge. Divine timing ensures that this divergence happens naturally. There is no need for confrontation or forcing outcomes. The separation unfolds as a result of inner alignment. One person becomes ready for deeper truth, accountability, and presence. The other remains committed to familiarity, even if it is limiting. Timing reveals readiness. This separation can feel painful, especially when there was genuine connection. But divine timing is not concerned with comfort, it is concerned with congruence. It brings together those who are willing to meet themselves honestly and gently distance those who are not yet ready. This is not a moral judgment, it is a reflection of capacity. Those who heal often wonder why the other person could not meet them where they arrived. The answer lies not in effort, but in timing. Growth cannot be synchronized if the willingness is unequal. Healing opens doors that hiding cannot walk through. And when one person crosses a threshold the other is unwilling to approach, separation becomes inevitable. Divine timing also protects the one who heals. It prevents them from staying anchored to potential rather than reality. It removes them from cycles that would require them to shrink, wait, or abandon their own progress. What feels like loss is often redirection. Those who hide may eventually face their lessons, but on a different timeline. Divine timing is patient, but it is also precise. It does not force readiness, it responds to it. And in that response, it gently but firmly separates those who are growing from those who are still running, not to create distance, but to honor truth. Detachment with dignity is more powerful than chasing closure, because it restores your alignment without demanding resolution from someone who cannot offer it. When you are hurt, the natural impulse is to seek answers, explanations, or acknowledgement. You want the story to make sense. You want your pain to be seen. Chasing closure feels like an act of self-respect, but when the other person is emotionally unavailable, it becomes an act of self-abandonment. Dignified detachment shifts the source of validation back where it belongs, within you. Closure is often imagined as a conversation, an apology, or a moment of clarity granted by the other person. But in avoidant dynamics, that moment is frequently delayed or denied. Waiting for it keeps you emotionally tethered to someone who has already chosen distance. Detachment does not mean indifference or bitterness, it means releasing the expectation that someone else must complete your healing. Dignity lies in how you disengage. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It is a quiet decision to stop over-explaining, stop chasing understanding, and stop negotiating your worth. When you detach with dignity, you choose self-respect over emotional urgency. You recognize that someone's inability to show up is information, not an invitation to prove your value. Chasing closure often reinforces the very dynamic that caused the pain. The more you pursue, the more the avoidant withdraws. This beats an imbalance where one person carries the emotional labor while the other maintains control through distance. Detachment disrupts this pattern. It removes you from the cycle without hostility or blame. You step out not because you are giving up, but because you are growing. There is strength in allowing silence to be final when it needs to be. Not all stories require a closing conversation. Some end through clarity rather than dialogue. Detachment honors the reality of what was given, not the fantasy of what could have been. It acknowledges that closure cannot come from someone who avoids truth. Detachment with dignity also protects your nervous system. Constantly seeking resolution from an unavailable source keeps your body in a state of anticipation and stress. Letting go allows your system to settle. You begin to reclaim emotional space that was consumed by waiting, hoping, or analyzing. Peace returns not because the past was fixed, but because you stopped reopening the wound. This form of detachment is an act of self-trust. You trust that you can carry unanswered questions without losing yourself. You trust that your worth does not require external confirmation. You trust that walking away from confusion is healthier than staying to decode it. Importantly, dignified detachment does not harden your heart. It refines it. You learn discernment. You become clearer about what you need and what you will no longer accept. This clarity strengthens future connections. You show up with boundaries rather than armor. In the end, chasing closure seeks relief from pain. Detachment with dignity creates transformation. It shifts you from reaction to authorship. And in that shift, you no longer need someone else to finish the story. You finish it by choosing yourself. As we close, remember this. What tried to break you was never meant to define you. It was meant to refine you. You were not abandoned. You were redirected toward truth, strength, and deeper alignment with who you are becoming. Let go with grace. Stand firm in your worth. And trust that what is meant to meet you will not require you to shrink, wait, or chase. Thank you for allowing this message to find you at the right moment in your journey. May you walk forward in clarity, peace, and quiet confidence. Goodbye, and may your path be guided by wisdom and purpose.